Hello, this is Aaron, and welcome back to the podcast. My guest today is Justin Shubow, who is the president of the National Civic Art Society, and he's the former chairman of the U.S. Commission on Fine Arts, which is the agency that oversees aesthetics for the federal government. So definitely a very robust role there. And he's also been rumored as a potential pick for chair of the National Endowment for the Arts in the new administration, which I will definitely be asking him about later. Now, I want to let you know that we are going to look at some pictures of buildings during this podcast. So for those of you who normally listen to the audio feed, you may want to click over to the YouTube version, and I'll be sure to put a link in the show notes to the YouTube version on Apple Podcasts. So, Justin, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
The New York Times and NPR have called you one of modern architecture's biggest critics. Why does the architecture of our public buildings matter? And why does it really matter if they're modernist or traditional?
Well, great leaders throughout history have understood the importance of architecture on the body politic. You could go all the way back to ancient Greece and look at Pericles and the building of the Parthenon as a statement about the greatness of Athens and, just how good their way of life was. More recently, we have people like Winston Churchill, who gave a speech where he famously said, "We shape our buildings, thereafter they shape us." He claimed that the design of the British Parliament, which had been bombed during World War II, played an important role in upholding the country's beneficent two-party system. And among other statesmen who've understood the importance of architecture, architecture influences how we think and feel all the time, even if we're not consciously paying attention to a building. There's strong subconscious influence. And architecture, if it's beautiful, can improve our day and inspire us. And if it's ugly, can just make us feel down and demoralized. But other famous statesmen who cared greatly about architecture were the founding fathers, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. Both, as you may know, were talented amateur architects. And Jefferson himself was an actual genius. They put great effort into the design of the core buildings of government in the new Capitol and also the plan of the city. And they decided that those buildings were to be classical in design, looking back to ancient Greece, ancient Rome, the origins of democracy and republicanism. They wished to look back to that heritage as a place, on which to found the new nation.
No, that makes that makes sense. And they built some great buildings. I mean, our public buildings, I think, like the Capitol building or the White House, hold up very well. When you compare it to even some of these European capitals that you think their buildings are, so much older, came from a different era. But we got some pretty good buildings that we've built in our country.
Oh, absolutely. Numerous surveys have shown that buildings like the White House and Capitol are among Americans' top 10 favorite buildings, along with things like the Jefferson Memorial, the Lincoln Memorial. And we shouldn't take this for granted. There are some other countries, especially those with newer capitals, that are not so beautiful or inspiring at all. I don't want to pick on too many, but to name just one, I encourage people to check out the relatively new Scottish Parliament building, which is this deconstructivist mess, and you have no idea that you're looking at a parliament building, let alone one that puts faith in the government. And it is interesting when you look at the history of American civic architecture. Yes, people know the White House and the Capitol, but looking farther back, there is also the Virginia Capitol designed by Thomas Jefferson, which was the first strict classical temple building in the United States and really set the standard for everything that would come thereafter. In looking back to Rome, the building was inspired by an ancient Roman temple in France. Through its architecture, it was essentially a repudiation of the British colonial tradition in architecture. It was kind of a cultural statement of independence. Yes, there you just put it up on the screen.
Yes.
And, it started what I think all Americans consider to be the architecture of democracy, which is classical architecture, buildings with pediments and columns, and so on, courthouses that look like courthouses. There is definitely a certain building type, like the U.S. Capitol, the way the U.S. Capitol has influenced the design of most state capitals across the country. There's something very special about classicism in the American tradition.
Yeah, so I pulled up some slides that you sent me of some of these buildings. The Virginia Capitol, a beautiful building, and I thought maybe we would just zip through these and take a look, and then we could get to the modern ones and contrast some of these. Hold on a second. Okay. We're looking there at a proposal for the Capitol. The U.S. Capitol building, which is great. I have heard, maybe you can tell me if this is true or not, that the Houses of Parliament in the UK, parts of them are actually newer than the U.S. Capitol building. That building was built to look old, but it's not really as old as it looks.
Yeah, the British Parliament was the British Houses of Commons were built in the 19th century, while the U.S. Capitol goes back to the early 1800s.
Yeah.
And in fact, it is interesting when it comes to architectural styles and their political associations. When the British were debating what kind of style the Parliament should be, ultimately they decided that the competition would require that the design be what they called Elizabethan or Gothic. And there was opposition to classical architecture because it was seen as being too Republican.
Interesting. There's a U.S. Capitol. Wow, just here on the screen, a post office in Mineral Wells, Texas.
I like this. I like this building. It's a small classical post office in a town that few people have ever heard of. But it demonstrates how classical architecture can provide dignity even on a small scale in places that might otherwise not have this kind of grandeur.
Yeah. Oh, the Federal Trade Commission. Yeah. Oh, wow. The Thurgood Marshall Courthouse in New York City. Beautiful building there.
This is a Beaux-Arts skyscraper by Cass Gilbert that was created in 1931 in New York City. And I like to point to it as an example of a very large classical building, demonstrating that classical architecture can do skyscrapers. In fact, a lot of the great skyscrapers in American history, such as the Empire State Building and the Chrysler Building, are classical in design. And so it's not an argument against classicism that you can't do large buildings.
Yeah. Supreme Court, of course, a very iconic building that we see on TV all the time.
Yeah, I mean, everyone knows what the Supreme Court looks like, but you have to remember that this was a building built in the quote-unquote modern era. Modern architecture was already highly ascendant in Europe and in architecture schools, but this was in many ways a throwback. And, if you are a modernist and believe that architecture, has to quote, follow the zeitgeist, we no longer wear togas, we no longer ride around in horses and buggies. Well, then why should we have a classical building with a pediment, steps, and columns, a building that is based on an ancient Roman temple? But I think it's obvious that this building has been incredibly successful and is beloved by Americans, both left and right.
And it lends a certain dignity to the court. And I mean, when you think about the respect that people have for the institutions of the country, there's something that just makes you think you're looking at a venerable institution. That's there.
Well, it's also an interesting question: to what extent can architecture shape behavior? there was a federal judge named Jeffrey Gallant, who was actually appointed by President Clinton, who presided in both modernist and classical courthouse. And he said that people in the courtroom were better behaved in the classical building.
Yeah. Of course, there's the Jefferson Memorial. The thing I like about, and I've, I'm on the record as publicly stating this, what I like about neoclassical or major public buildings is that it anchors us in the 2,500 year history of Western civilization, right? It connects us backwards and forwards in sort of a chain of our ancestors and descendants, that we're part of a project that is larger than ourselves, larger than just our generation. And I think it lends a sense of permanence and a sense of seriousness about the future. That we should think beyond just the immediate now.
Absolutely. I mean, I think we often live in an era, in a state of presentism, but classical architecture forces us to think in centuries or even millennia, connecting us back to the founders, connecting us to the Renaissance, connecting us to the ancient world, looking at the grand sweep of Western civilization. And that's why people use terms like timelessness to describe the architecture.
Yeah. I think maybe we're getting into some of the modern ones now. And, I'll just, in the interest of full disclosure, I like a lot of modern and contemporary architecture. I think when it's done well, it can be great, and it can be really great. Too often it's not done well, unfortunately. And the government seems to have done a particularly bad job of it compared to private clients. But you've got some stink bombs in here. We'll go through. This is the Kansas City Federal Building.
Yeah, I would describe it as just an utterly forgettable box.
Yeah,
these sorts
that's exactly
of
right.
Sorry?
I said it's absolutely right. I was thinking, I'm not familiar with this building. When I looked at it, when you sent me the slideshow, I'm like, this isn't like necessarily offending me horribly when I see it, but it's utterly forgettable.
Right.
It's not something that you would associate as a major public building or a major public space. The federal courthouse in Billings, Montana. This is kind of sad. This looks like, a low rent, accounting back office for some.
Right. And I would point out that you can't even tell what the purpose of these buildings is.
Right.
Is this a public building? Is this a courthouse? It could be anything. And in fact, there were some modernist architects who said that a building should not show its purposes. So it might not be an accident that there's nothing identifiable about the building itself.
Now, this is the Federal Center in Chicago, which was designed by Mies van der Rohe. Now, he is one of the greatest, most reputed modern architects. And I generally find his work to be good compared to his imitators, although this has become an incredibly unwelcoming place in Chicago. What's your take on this building?
Well, I included this because I didn't want to appear that I'm just picking on no-name architects.
Yeah.
This is one of those black glass and steel international style buildings that Mies van der Rohe was famous for. Mies was a German architect who in the 1930s actively sought work from the Nazi government and even signed a letter Heil Hitler. So this whole idea that there is something noble about modernist architecture and there's something ignoble about classical, I think it's a lot more complicated than that. But you'll find that in architecture, having been a Nazi has not necessarily been a hindrance for one's career. But this building is another example of a federal building that might as well be an office building. It's the architecture of rational bureaucracy. There's no grandeur about it. There's no ornament, no detailing. And I would say there's a lack of overall beauty. But if you could move to the next slide. So here we're looking at the poster for the movie, The Trial of the Chicago Seven, a relatively new movie about that famous trial that took place in the 1960s. The
Aaron
poster,
Sorkin film, it looks like.
right. The poster, it shows the exterior of a building that is the courthouse, and it's a classical building. The trial itself actually took place in that Mies van der Rohe steel and glass box. But in the movie, they use a classical exterior and a classical interior because that, I believe, is how Americans think when they think of what a courthouse looks like or ought to look like. What kind of building should one expect to get justice in?
This is the HUD building in Washington, D.C. Is this the Robert C. Weaver building, or is this a different one?
Yes, it's the Weaver building.
Yeah.
The HUD is a brutalist building. I mean, just ginormous in size. Brutalism is a style of architecture that began in the mid-century that uses lots of exposed concrete, modular repetition, very deep surfaces on the exterior, sometimes having rough surfaces, and I think often instills a state of fear and terror for the people who have to use the building. So this building is in Washington, D.C. in the Southwest Quadrant, and 3 different HUD secretaries, one of them Republican, 2 of them Democrat, have said that this building is like 10 floors of basement. And one of those guys, Julian Castro, who was secretary under Clinton, also said that this reminded him of a building from the Soviet Union. So here we have bipartisan opposition to brutalism. But at the same time, the General Services Administration, the agency responsible for all federal buildings, they have a modernist and postmodernist agenda, and they uphold this building as an example of excellence in federal design. So it shows how the government bureaucrats have a view of architecture that widely diverges from that of cabinet secretaries and of ordinary people themselves.
Yeah, the term brutalism comes from the French béton brut, which means raw concrete. But I think it's kind of there's so many ironies about this, because if we just think of it as brutal in the English sense of the word, it's pretty accurate. I mean, this is of all the styles of modernist architecture, this seems to be the least forgiving, in the sense it's very difficult to create a truly excellent building in this kind of style, and very easy to create something that's horrible. But also the case that HUD kind of promoted the construction of public housing built in this style all over America as we demolished all these historic buildings for urban renewal projects, I think now viewed as a colossal error. And so maybe there's an irony that their own employees in D.C. have to work in something like this. Although Weaver, the reason I mentioned Weaver, he was the first secretary of HUD and also the first black cabinet secretary. Not exactly a fitting honor for him to have this building of this caliber named after him.
No, and just to be clear, this building was designed by Marcel Breuer, who's considered one of the great modernist architects.
Yeah.
So again, I'm not picking on no names.
Yeah. Let me see. Maybe we'll pick a couple more here, and then kind of I'll leave some up on there. But here's one in Salt Lake City.
So
the courthouse in Salt Lake City.
So this is a relatively new courthouse that's been constructed under the current design program at the General Services Administration. I think the best way to describe it is it looks like the Borg cube from Star Trek, the enemy alien spacecraft.
You weren't the only one who said that.
Right.
Yeah.
So here is the cover of Salt Lake City Weekly titled "Resistance is Futile: How Utah Ended Up with the Borg Cube for a Federal Courthouse." And mind you, this is the liberal newspaper in Salt Lake City.
Yeah, this is their alt weekly, I assume. Yeah.
It's a building that's just widely hated, and yet at the same time, taxpayers are spending hundreds of millions of dollars on these buildings.
Wow. Now, in the Trump administration, there was an attempt made to pivot federal design back towards a classical approach. What was your role in that?
So my organization, the National Civic Art Society, we had a meeting at the White House and saying that we need to do something about our federal buildings. You might want to show one more, the San Francisco Federal Building, which I think is the worst of the worst.
Let's see if I can find that here.
It's the direct next one after.
Okay, here we go. Yeah,
there we go.
Yeah, this is infamous.
Yeah, saying something has gone terribly wrong, that we need to return to the great history going back to the founders that lasted essentially for 150 years until the rise of modernism. And that we want federal buildings that are beloved by ordinary Americans, that inspire patriotism and civic pride. So Trump, ultimately, as a result of this meeting, issued an executive order that we helped draft that was revolutionary. It reoriented federal design, which had been almost entirely modernist, in a classical and traditional direction. And both classical and traditional were very broadly defined. So, for instance, classical included everything from neoclassical to Beaux-Arts to Art Deco. Art Deco is the last of the classical styles, and I think is really loved to this day. And traditional architecture was defined broadly to include everything from Romanesque to Gothic to Pueblo Revival. There would be a wide variety of historic styles across the country. As for Washington, D.C. itself, the order was at its strictest, requiring that new federal buildings in Washington be classical, since Washington is a classical city with the core buildings of government being classical in design. But for the rest of the country, there was to be diversity, but there was to be special regard for classical and traditional design. The order also required that there be input from the general public when design decisions were being made. This is very important since GSA at present does not include any input from the public in its design process. In fact, there was a case in Orlando where the judges there, the federal judges, asked GSA for a traditional design, and GSA fought them and foisted a modernist design on them. So not even the judges themselves have been able to get the sorts of courthouses they want. But we believe it's important that there be an element of democracy in design, and the executive order did that. Alas, almost immediately after taking office, Biden rescinded that order. The order was issued only at the end of Trump's term. Mm-hmm. Biden rescinded it. There had the order, which I think was widely popular with ordinary Americans, was absolutely hated by the architectural establishment, which is nearly entirely modernist in outlook. And you have to understand also that there's a lot of money at stake here. Certain firms are used to getting these giant projects, and the executive order could change all of that. At the same time, you had cultural elites like the New York Times arguing vociferously against the executive order. The New York Times published an editorial titled, "What's So Great About Fake Roman Temples?" To me, the implication of that argument is that the U.S. Capitol and the Jefferson Memorial and the U.S. Supreme Court are all equally fake, because none of those buildings are 2,000 years old. Many people on the left said that classical architecture was racist, the architecture of white supremacy, or, they said that Hitler liked classical architecture. Now, I think all of that is completely bogus. In 2020, my organization did a survey by the Harris Poll, very reputable, nonpartisan polling company, to determine Americans' preferences in federal architecture. And the survey found that the vast majority of the people surveyed, 72%, preferred classical and traditional architecture for federal buildings and U.S. courthouses. Not only was there that, overwhelming victory for tradition, but there was wide preference for tradition across all demographic groups, including gender, race, socioeconomic, and also political party affiliation, with I think about 72% of Republican or 73% of Republicans preferring tradition and 70% of Democrats. So this is actually an issue that all normal people can agree upon. It's an issue about the people versus a tiny bunch of elites who have for too long been controlling our public architecture. Now, it was unfortunate that Biden rescinded the order and he didn't give any explanation for doing so. But later, legislation was proposed in Congress by Senator Marco Rubio in the Senate and Jim Banks of Indiana in the House. And as you may know, Jim Banks was just elected to the Senate and Marco Rubio is going on to Secretary of State. But that executive order that legislation would have essentially codified Trump's executive order and required that there be even more public input than the order initially stated. Now, that legislation, which included J.D. Vance as a co-sponsor, ultimately didn't go anywhere. But I have very high hopes about what's likely to happen under the next Trump administration. I'd be shocked if he doesn't reissue the executive order. And I think that would be just the beginning of doing even bigger things, looking at American public art and architecture. I mean, J.D. Vance himself tweeted in 2022 that America used to build beautiful public buildings. So it's an issue that he himself seems to care about. And this is not even just about President Trump. The 2024 Republican platform said that Republicans will promote beauty in public buildings and build cherished symbols of the nation. The platform also called for making Washington the most beautiful capital city. So I would expect to see President Trump take a bold, strong move on architecture.
Yeah, it's weird that of all, you hear a lot about, there's a deep state, or, there's the administrative class that's totally opposed to everything President Trump wants to do. And, maybe say, well, maybe when it comes to trade policy or something, you can understand why there might be people who feel that way. But it's amazing the incredible institutional resistance to classical architecture. As you say, the entire architectural establishment hates it. All the major media, hates it. The bureaucracy hates it. So he's really going up against quite a formidable array of people who will surely do everything that they can for the next 4 years to stymie any efforts to move us in this direction. Well, again, your name has been floated as a possibility for chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts. So I'm curious, should you happen to get that job, what would your vision be for an agency like NEA?
Well, first off, I don't want to be presumptuous about being appointed by the president, but it would certainly be a true honor to serve. I mean, to step back, one must understand that the National Endowment for the Arts is an independent federal agency that's the largest funder of the arts and arts education in the country. It aims to be a catalyst for public and private support for the arts, and its annual budget is around $210 million. My vision for the NEA comes from Dana Gioia, the brilliant poet who was NEA chair under President George W. Bush. Gioia said, "A great nation deserves great art." And I couldn't believe more. I'd like to see major change at the agency. For a long time, Republican politicians have called for eliminating the NEA, but I think that this is because they don't believe the agency is fostering great art. I'd like to change that. In my view, the highest art is that which is beautiful, profound, and or moving. It is a reflection of the human condition. If you go into a contemporary art museum today, how much art do you see that is beautiful, profound, or moving? I think too often there's very little. And then NEA needs to do its part to change that. This country needs a cultural and artistic renaissance, and the NEA can play a key role in that. For instance, there's real opportunity for the NEA to play an important role in celebrating the country's semi-quincentennial, or as some prefer to call it, America 250, since that's a lot easier to say and remember. But I emphasize the word celebrating when it comes to America 250, since some debunkers, people immersed in the culture of repudiation, have instead been using the term commemorate instead of celebrate. They don't want to valorize the country's founding and indeed our overall history. As part of America 250, I'd like to create an initiative celebrating and fostering the grand tradition of beautiful American civic architecture that goes back to the founding. That includes everything from the Virginia Capitol designed by Thomas Jefferson that I mentioned, to the original Penn Station in New York, which was a magnificent Beaux-Arts design inspired by ancient Roman baths. I'd also say regarding possibilities at the NEA, President Trump recently announced that he'll be issuing or reissuing an executive order like the one he issued in his first term to build a garden of American heroes. The garden will feature statues of numerous great figures from American history. The EO specifically requires that the NEA chairman play a role. And perhaps the NEA, under my leadership, could help ensure a very high artistic quality for the statues. The last thing we want are statues that are more like mannequins or pieces of kitsch. I think, for instance, of some of the statues of athletes outside sports stadiums that have been very badly done. Two really notorious ones are of Cristiano Ronaldo and Dwayne Wade. But at the same time, there are tremendous classically trained sculptors out there like Sabin Howard, who recently did the new National World War I Memorial in Washington. And another example of a very talented architect, sculptor, is Chaz Fagan. And people like them need to be hired to do the job. Something else I would like to focus on at the NEA is devoting attention to the Big Read, which is an initiative started by Dana Gioia that encourages communities to read the same books at the same time. The original book selections under Gioia were timeless novels such as Fahrenheit 451, Their Eyes Were Watching God, The Great Gatsby, and To Kill a Mockingbird. Starting under the Obama administration, however, the reading selections became much more focused on trendy contemporary books with an implicit, if not explicit, emphasis on identity politics. I'd like to return the Big Read to its original intent.
Yeah, when I think of the NEA, and I just think of all the times that the agency funded art that almost seemed to be designed to offend conservatives or poke them in the eye. I think the NEA funded that infamous Piss Christ art. It's almost sacrilegious to say it. And just, which was essentially, I think, a crucifix suspended upside down in urine and crazy stuff like that. And definitely, the art world, like the architecture world, is deeply hostile to anything that's traditionally beautiful, and maybe even worse, hostile to the actual, people who vote Republican. Maybe I'm overly cynical on that, but change is needed there. That's for sure.
Yeah, to this day, people do not forget what happened with that Piss Christ piece of art that you're talking about. Or there was also a notorious exhibition by Robert Mapplethorpe that included, photographs of all sorts of graphic BDSM sex acts and things that I don't even want to describe. I mean, that was a long time ago. Those controversies were in the late 80s, but Republicans definitely still have not forgotten. And I think their concern is that, well, maybe the NEA is not funding things as extreme as that. I think the NEA learned their lesson, but is it funding, mediocre art, conceptual art that only the cognoscenti understand? And then, of course, we're not just talking about artworks, paintings, and sculpture, but dance and music, podcasts that educate the public. There's all sorts of incredible opportunities out there, funding writers who can really speak to who Americans are today. And we don't want to be focused on identity politics at the expense of producing great art and literature.
No. Well, let's hope something like that actually happens here in terms of moving in a better direction on both the art and the architecture front. Is there anything else maybe that I didn't ask that you wish I'd asked you'd like to share in kind of a concluding thought?
Well, I would just recommend that people check out the new art in the World War I Memorial in Washington. It's this enormous classical bronze relief by Saban Howard called A Soldier's Journey. It's a cinematic telling of a story of a soldier leaving home, going into, marching with his comrades at arms, going into the crucible of battle. Now you're showing some.
Yeah. You had some pictures in here, so I put some up in the presentation that we can see some of these beautiful sculptures.
The work is full of dynamism, emotion, pathos. What's incredible about it is, yes, it absolutely shows the loss and suffering during the war. This, for instance, is a dead or wounded soldier being held up by others. That is clearly based on Michelangelo's Pietà, in which Mary holds the dead Christ. But you'll also notice behind them on the wall, it's not so easy to make out here, is a twisted cross, somehow reminiscent of European civilization self-destructing and leading to all sorts of harmful things to come. But at the same time that the memorial shows the loss and the tragedy, it also evinces heroism and valor as well. There is bravery in this memorial. It's not another victim memorial, which has pretty much been the trend in American commemorative works ever since the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, which is a minimalist, bleak design that was perhaps appropriate for the Vietnam War, but that kind of minimalism and bleakness is, I think, not appropriate to a war like World War I. And my organization played a role behind the scenes in the production of this memorial through a competition, ensuring that the competition required that the entries show valor and heroism among the soldiers. And if you might want to scroll one more photo, I think the memorial concludes with a victory parade with the troops carrying an American flag. This is a patriotic memorial representing America ascendant on the world stage. And let's be honest, this kind of patriotism is often out of line with the general trend in the contemporary art world. Saban himself, the sculptor, said that he thinks that American artists too often treat the public the way that the government does. In other words, not in a beneficial way. But he wanted to design a monument that is legible, that is understandable by ordinary people. You don't need to be an art critic. You don't need a sign or a tour guide to understand what's going on. This memorial is an exclamation point, not a question mark. And I'm hoping that this design could represent the beginning of a cultural renaissance in this country. And maybe the NEA, under my leadership or somebody like me, could help make that happen.
Yeah, I had not seen these sculptures before you sent me this, and I really like them. I like that they harken back to sculptures like them on many monuments that were built, in the past. But at the same time, it doesn't look retro. This isn't like an imitation Saturday Evening Post cover or something like it. It looks very much contemporary as well. It's got a sort of timeless quality to it that I think is what we want in terms of it not looking like, oh, that's so 1970s or something like that, or so right. 2024. I don't think that's what we want in something that's going to be a long time. So I think it's great. So, well, thank you very much for coming on the show. My guest today has been Justin Shubow. He's the president of the National Civic Art Society and the former chairman of the U.S. Commission on Fine Arts. Thank you so much for joining, Justin.
Thanks for having me.